we come here today to talk about intent-based leadership, which may or may not mean very much to you at the moment. But I just wanted to sort of introduce you to an idea that I came across probably about 3 years ago now, and I've had quite a lot of experience implementing it within one particular organization, and now in a couple of other organizations as well. So in terms of what we're going to cover, we'll talk a little bit about the origins of IBL. It's quite a compelling story, quite an interesting story. We will look at VUCA. That may or may not be a familiar acronym to you. And I just want to sort of talk through it and what it actually means. And then we'll get to the meat of of this evening, when we're actually just going to go through the 6 principles of IBL. We'll look at a couple of practices. We'll hear from David Marquet in a couple of videos. And then towards the end of the session, just tackle one of the challenges that I've come across with IBL in terms of its adoption. And that is that people feeling that they don't have time for IBL or to adopt it. So I just wanted to sort of work on that idea up front, and then we'll wrap up and we will sort of go from there. So the IBL origins, it's a really quite a compelling story. The Santa Fe is a nuclear submarine. It was the worst performing nuclear submarine in the fleet, in the US fleet of about 50 submarines. And at the last minute, David Marquet was made the commander of the submarine. So he'd been spending the previous year learning about a different submarine altogether, and suddenly he found himself in this one. And the result was he didn't really know much about this one. And so about 2 weeks into since boarding it, he gave an instruction to somebody to go into second gear in the submarine, and this instruction was passed on, this command, to the next person, and the sailor who was due to implement it sort of looked up quizzically because this submarine did not have a second gear. And at that moment, David realized that he could not give instructions on this submarine because he did not know as much about it as everybody else there. And so started the most interesting year and a half of essentially a little experiment in a steel tube under the water of 140 people about giving up control. How do you give up control in a submarine when you are the commander? And I'm sure for most of you, that's probably difficult imagining any organization or place on Earth which is probably more hierarchical and more risky than a nuclear submarine. So the 10 years later, David had sort of met up with a few people from the submarine, and he took it within 18 months from being the worst performing submarine. And there's within the US Navy, they measure this all the time. And it went to the top performing submarine. So from the worst to the best within 18 months. But most importantly, he then left after about 2 years, and it stayed as the best performing submarine in the US Navy for another 9 years after he left. And it was based on, because of that sort of legacy, he sort of decided there was something special here and he needed to write a book about it. So the book he wrote, Turn the Ship Around, which some of you have probably read, some of you have heard about, and for some of you that this might be the first time you've heard it, but it's a compelling story. He writes very well. And IBL really is the leadership framework that has arisen from that book and has been adopted for business in all sorts of different businesses. So that's where we get IBL from. IBL, intent-based leadership. I'll explain that to you as we go through the different sort of aspects of it. The other part of the title of today is VUCA. And I just wanted to just make sure that we're not making any assumptions about what VUCA is and what it means. So VUCA is an acronym. Again, it developed in the military, but it's quite commonly used now in business. And it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in many ways, it defines the world that we work in, especially if you're in software development and so on. You live in a VUCA world. It's really difficult to predict. Things are changing. There's multiple variables coming at you from different ways. And the reality in front of you is very hazy. It's very ambiguous. And in this VUCA world, leadership needs to look different. We can't rely on leadership in a sort of more traditional, sort of hierarchical way. We sort of know that anyway, but this sort of makes it a bit more explicit. And it leaves us sort of thinking about what is a sort of a continual challenge for us, which is if that old leadership style isn't working, then what do we replace it with? It's one thing to say that it's not appropriate, but what do we use instead? So intent-based leadership really is sort of summarized as a way of challenging the traditional assumptions and models. So going back for the last sort of couple of hundred years, the industrial age and so on, of hierarchical leadership. And it really sort of turns on its head this idea about leaders and followers, and the idea that we have the people and throughout the organization are leading. And again, I think this has really strong echoes with our Agile approach, our Agile values, our principles, that we need leaders at all levels. And again, that might be an easy thing to say, but how do you actually make that happen? So IBL is a global organization now, IBL International. I just wanted to give you some origin of the term and how it's being developed and sort of delivered to organizations around the world. So there's IBL International, and then within the UK, there's a company in Edinburgh called Remarkable, and I am a IBL pioneer accredited by Remarkable. And I learned my IBL techniques and practices working with Kate Carmichael on a client. We've got a couple of them on the call today, a client called Mimecast. So at Mimecast over the last 18 months or so, or 2 years now, we've practiced IBL, and I've come to see it firsthand at a team level, at an individual sort of leader level, and the first line of leadership. So in that time, coming to experiment with it and try it out and see its effect and see how it lands, it's really been quite exciting. And I've come to understand a lot about how it lands in an organization rather than just in a sort of abstract way. One of the things that I came to sort of realize at Mimecast, but also probably in all of the organizations that I've worked in over the last 20 years adopting Agile, is that a lot of the challenges, a lot of the reasons why adopting Agile was difficult weren't really about processes. It wasn't really about the sort of techniques and technical aspect of it. I put it down to leadership. Leadership that was either not there because people hadn't been supported or given a way of understanding leadership, or leadership that was inappropriate. And so quite quickly came to see that IBL offered to new leaders who were otherwise sort of looking around them for ideas and guidance, some sort of framework by which they could put into practice their ideas. So I'm going to just break us out now into rooms for a bit of a chat. And there's 24 of us on the call today. And I've got a moment of reflection. So if you I'm thinking most of you are leaders in one way and another. You might be a manager, you might be leading on the technical side, you may be a scrum master, but you're leading in different ways. So as a newly promoted leader, just in fours, in groups of four, Helen's going to help in a second and break us up into groups of four. What support did you get from your organization in this step up to being a leader? What forms of training or coaching or frameworks were given to you and shared with you? What types of challenges did you face when you were stepped up to this role as leader? And what do you wish you had known in those early days of leading others, which you now know? So what was it that what little element of knowledge or insight did you not have at the beginning that you would love to have had now? Anybody want to share from their room topics that came up, things you've noticed about the three questions? What support did you get from the organization? What challenges did you face? And what do you wish you'd known back then?
Sure. I mean, we did get training, formal training on various methods. Bruce Tolgan, someone else on our team had a mentor, a good mentor, and then we all agreed that understanding the different people that you work with has a huge effect. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their personalities, and then understanding the mission or the intent, like you were saying, is pretty crucial. Make sure everyone's aligned. Kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think frameworks and models and the sort of the surveys about group and team dynamics would be quite a I see that quite often in different organizations. Jana, did you put your hand up? Jana? No, you didn't. Okay. But how about techniques, Daryl? Were there sort of techniques for you to use as well from a leader's point of view?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely models and books like 5 Dysfunctions of Teams, right? The hierarchy there. I know I was trained on the ADKAR model, but I think that's kind of been looked down upon a little bit.
Right, I'm not familiar with that one.
Extreme ownership.
Okay.
Jocko Willis.
Oh, I know that one. Yeah.
I don't know. There's Bruce Tolgan's "It's Okay to Be the Boss," which isn't necessarily leadership per se, but more management. But yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the ones that I know of.
Yeah. Anyone want to share about the challenges they faced about becoming a leader? As an individual, stepping up from maybe a role that you were very good at, coding or product or something, into the next role of actually leading a team. Yeah, Marina.
I remember that a long time ago when I was young and not too smart, I guess, I was kind of appointed as a team lead and I was so happy. But really, I got a lot of new responsibilities, but close to zero power. And it was a real struggle for me because I had to be responsible for a lot of things without being able to influence on anything. And then after that, I decided that I don't want to continue doing like this anymore, but it was a good lesson in my career.
That's an interesting point you raise about not being given the power, because I think in some organizations you would expect somehow that the power is something that comes with the role. And then you went on to say about, influencing people. And I think that's one of the aspects of intent-based leadership, is how do you influence people around you when you don't have formal power or sort of organizational power? and you still have the responsibilities, but you can still influence and shape and change the climate of the team around you. Yeah. Anyone else got an insight or thought or experience they would like to share? No? Okay.
For me, it would be very similar to the last one. Was once you're appointed or elevated to leadership, we found out actually whenever you try to change anything, there's a massive pushback and massive resistance to any sort of any idea of even small changes. So the leadership was actually, well, what does it mean by leadership then if I can't do anything to change?
Yeah. It's sort of like leader is change agent, not just sort of making things run better, but actually trying to make change as well, and the resistance you get. Yeah. Okay, well, hopefully into that context, I just now wanted to talk through the 6 principles of intent-based leadership. So I'm going to start sharing the slides again, and let me just go and do that. So hopefully you can see that slide. So one of the I think compelling aspects of intent-based leadership is its relative simplicity. So we're going to start with the 6 principles. So I'm going to go into each of these one by one and just sort of explain a little bit about them. But essentially, for those of you that have been in the Agile space for a while, you might notice or recognize some of these ideas, maybe phrased a little bit differently. But as I said up at the front, I think there's a lot of overlap here between the values of Agile and Scrum and Lean and so on, and leadership. I think these things sit very well together. Now, each of these, and one of the things that we heard quite a bit when we were introducing this in organizations is that people didn't really want just another abstract leadership model. There's a lot of those around. They wanted something that was pragmatic and that they could actually take to work. And I think that's one of the areas in which intent-based leadership is really significantly different from other models and frameworks. So I won't go through them all, but just to give you a clue, a hint at some of them, for each one of these principles, there are a handful of exercises, little techniques, little changes in the way that you interact with people, things that you can do in the moment, things that you might take a while to sort of put in place and do over time. But they are very much a way of getting traction for you within your teams and the people that you work with. Now, I'm going to illustrate some of these as we go around, but I just wanted you to have that sort of sense that, as well as that simple framework of 6, we also have ways in which we bring these to life at a team, at an individual level. So the first one of these, just focusing in on it, is don't be good, get better. And this really speaks to a study done by Carol Dweck, who wrote a book called Mindset, The New Psychology of Success. Now, she wrote a lot of this about her observations in education and young people in education in particular, and the difference between the fixed mindset on the left, where you're sort of holding on to what you have and you're quite protective of it, sort of intellectually and emotionally, and on the right, where you're actually looking for challenge and learning and exploring and exploration and so on. And it was quite distinct, the behaviors that she would see even in sort of 4-year-olds and how they responded to a puzzle that was just a little bit too difficult. If you had a fixed mindset and you got one of these puzzles, your energy drained out of you as you sort of worried about getting it wrong and it was outside of your stretch. Whereas if you had a growth mindset and you were given one of these puzzles, you expanded into it. So, oh, goody, I don't know how to do this one, and how do I? Now, that difference between holding on to what we have and being open to what's possible is a useful frame context for IBL. It sort of permeates through a lot of the other parts of the framework and the model. The next principle that we're going to highlight is leaders make it safe and not add stress. Now, this takes me on to one of my favorite topics, which is psychological safety. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware of psychological safety. You've heard of it. And you may have even sort of studied it a little bit. It goes back to some research that back in the late 90s, where she was looking at the effectiveness of teams in nursing, in high intensity nursing teams. And her hypothesis was, the good nursing teams would be the ones who made fewer mistakes. In fact, she found the opposite, that the better nursing teams, the ones with best outcomes, were making more mistakes, or at least they were reporting more mistakes. And this was a real sort of breakthrough observation of hers, but it stayed pretty much undiscovered and untalked about for about 15 years until a study, which again, I think quite a few of you would know about, Project Aristotle came along, and Google set about trying to explain what makes a team effective at Google. And having studied all the variables that you would expect, like diversity, the age profile, educational levels of the team, co-location, that sort of thing, they found very weak correlation between any of those and team effectiveness. So the lead of the study rummaged around and discovered this rather obscure white paper written by Amy Edmondson. And they reran this study at Google. It was 180 teams. And they concluded after that, and it was quite a rigorous study, as you'd expect at Google, lots of numbers, lots of methodology, and so on. And they concluded that psychological safety was far and away the most important of the 5 dynamics. So it is important that the teams have meaning, that they have some structure and clarity about the roles that they play and so on, that you could be dependable. But above it all and underpinning it all was psychological safety. So that's the second of the 6 IBL principles. Leaders make it safe, not add stress. The third of the principles is quite an interesting one. It's pushing authority to information, not information to authority. And again, for people well versed in the Agile world, we know about the importance of feedback loops and so on, but essentially we've got a situation where we've got teams of people working very close to this very sort of volatile, uncertain work. It's complex, it's ambiguous, and so on. And that is where the richest information is. Down here in the work is where the information is. But if you look at the organization, the authority is somewhere else. Now, if you sort of remember back to the story of the Santa Fe, the people with the information about how the engines ran and whether or not we had second gear were the people closest to it. And in comes a commander who didn't know this stuff, but had all the authority. Now, you can see probably from that just where these ideas sort of began to emerge. If we look at it from a sort of Agile point of view, the feedback loop for somebody in this team, if they have to go all the way up to authority and come back down again, is obviously way too long. So how do you make the feedback loop just a little bit smaller again, and a little bit smaller again? So that's what push authority to information looks like. The point about this, though, is that it takes deliberate, calibrated action. To move authority down to information is not something you just sort of stand back and say, well, I trust everybody, everybody's good. I know that they're very good at this, so I trust them to make the right decisions. That's a lot closer to abdication. That's leadership by sort of stepping away and not doing anything. And I've seen that time and time again in different clients. through no fault of the leader. Maybe they didn't have a mechanism by which they could pass that authority down. But one of the things that IBL does give us is sort of really useful language and frameworks. So, for example, we'll look at this one in a second, but certify, don't brief is an example of a technique. Another one is to give up some control. So, you can be quite playful with this, like, the next time you're out at a restaurant, feel what it's like in yourself to sort of say to the waiter, well, you choose for me. What is that like as a leader to give up even that relatively trivial piece of control to somebody else? So that's what pushing authority to information is about, really. I'm going to pause for a second just because I forgot to optimize for video clip. So slide is a video clip. So this is an example of a leadership nudge. So every week, and I think he's up to about 390 of these now, David Marquet puts up onto YouTube a 90-second video, 1 minute to 90-second video that sort of highlights some aspect of IBL. So it's a great resource. And this is, I wanted you to also hear David Marquet's sort of voice in the mix as well, rather than just mine. But this is David explaining the technique of certified don't brief.
Hi, you're in charge of a team and you're about to engage in a major operation or an evolution, a very important crane lift or surgical procedure or airplane taking off, or for us, starting up the reactor. So you gather the team together and you do a briefing, and we review with each person what their responsibilities are. At the end, we say, hey, how you doing? Any questions? You understand? Everyone understands, nods, and then you go off and do it. Okay? Well, don't do that. Cancel all your briefings. The problem is briefings are very passive for all of the participants. The only person really involved is the person doing the briefing. Instead of doing a briefing, do a certification. Certification is different from a briefing in two different ways. Number one, the participants say what their responsibilities are during this operation, where they might be looking, key decisions that they might have to make. And then number two, the person in charge makes a decision that we're ready to move forward. So number one, it's from the participants up, and number two, there's a decision that we're ready to move forward. Certified, don't brief. I'm David Marquet, and that's your leadership nudge.
So that's a pretty good example of a leadership nudge. It's just a little bit of information, a little idea, a little prompt to sort of get you thinking slightly differently. And as I say, there's 390 of those. So you can pop in and have a look at that. At the end of the session, I'll give you a link to the YouTube channel, so you can have a look at those. The next principle is possibly the most important one in terms of effectively giving control away and delegating to a group of people. So we have the control, but it's founded on two very important pillars: the level of competence of the people that you're giving control to, and the clarity of what you're trying to achieve, so that they can align and understand the why behind the control that you're giving them. So
Bazil,
yes.
Just conscious that we're seeing your presenter view slides. We're not seeing the actual full
sorry.
slide. Yeah.
Okay, my fault. Sorry. So what are you seeing now? The
trees.
Okay, good. That's the right view.
Perfect.
Okay, good. So you've got the competence and clarity, and again, the challenge here is how do you actually do this. So having a look at competence. So if we put control up on the left-hand side, so this is giving away more control, and competence and clarity along the x-axis, and we draw a line down the middle. If people had a lot of competence and clarity, but you didn't give them a lot of control, it's pretty frustrating. They get bored, they get frustrated, they're starting to look around. This is not a place that they want to be in particularly. It's comfortable, but it's a little bit dull and frustrating. On the other side of this, and again, I've seen this in startups and in smaller organizations, is pretty chaotic, where there's a lot of control given around to people, but they don't necessarily have the competence or the clarity to do much with that control. And it gets pretty chaotic and stressful in the chaos zone. So somewhere in the middle here is where we want to be. There's a sort of a stable zone where you've just got enough and it's a little bit stretching, but it's not really taking you anywhere. But then there's the growth zone. And in the growth zone, this is the place where people are being given a little bit more control. And this is a nice twist, actually, in the way that David Marquet explains this. Instead of waiting for them to have the competence and clarity and then giving them a bit more control, how about giving them a bit more control first and letting the competence and clarity get up to that level? Now, there's a technique which is at the heart of IBL here called the ladder of leadership. And in this technique, which David's going to explain, and I just realized I didn't. You'll have to tell me, Helen, if the audio is good enough, please. But he's going to talk us through the ladder of leadership, which is what you can see on the left here. So instead of sort of saying or just sort of expecting people to have that control, you as the leader get to really be quite precise about where that person is in this moment or where that team is. So they come to you and say, well, tell me what to do. You are going to take them up through level 2, 3, 4, and to 5, which is the sort of level of intent. Now, I'll let David speak first so that we're not repeating each other, and then I'll come back to this in a second.
I don't want to overcomplicate this idea of intent-based leadership. It's really very, very simple. Every time someone comes to you and says, tell me what to do, you don't tell them what to do. You resist that urge. Now, where you go exactly from there depends on where they are and where you are in the context of the situation. But we would frame it up like this. Hey, tell me what to do. I'm inviting them up to higher levels. What do you see? What do you think? What would you like to do? What do you recommend? What do you propose? And then what do you intend to do? Now, the difference here is with level 4, the team needs approval before moving forward. This is what we call a permission-based organization, and it's the most common structure that we see. I request this, I get a stamp of approval, I can go offer a bigger discount, I go launch the product, whatever it happens to be. In an intent-based organization, we flip the bias so that the default is we're going to do it unless you stop me. So there's a veto, there's still veto ability resting in leadership. But now the team's going to do it if there's no response. Hey, tomorrow noon, I intend to offer the following discount. I send that email, I don't get a response, I'm still good. I'm not held up, I'm not panicking, I'm not making a last minute phone call to the boss to see if I have permission to give this discount. I'm doing it. That's the power of intent. That's why you get ownership and alignment. It's alignment because we can check on the behaviors and the activities before the decision is made, but it's ownership because it's coming from the team. I'm David Marquet. This is the ladder of leadership. It's a
So, sorry, don't start again. So that's the ladder of leadership. It's as David said there, it's a sort of an in the moment exercise. When somebody comes and asks you, you can immediately tune into where they're at and just help them sort of move up the ladder towards that action orientated, that bias for action, so that they're sort of going off to do something rather than waiting for permission to do it. The next technique, the next principle is about leaders fix the environment, not the people. And again, something that keeps recurring in an agile sort of context around we fixate on the people and the process, whereas around them, the systemic sort of challenges are the ones that remain difficult to see, and we don't address them as clearly as we could. So probably one of the most famous quotes in sort of agile thinking from Edwards Deming about the causes, the reasons for failure in a process or in a program are to do with the systems rather than the individuals. Possible issues that you might be looking at is how are people measured? How do you make the invisible visible? So what are the trends and the patterns in the data in how we're doing, and how do we sort of begin to address that? Do people have the tools for the job that we're asking them to do? Have we given them time to pause, reflect, change, or are we just endlessly working on deliver? Now that term blue thinking and red thinking actually comes out of David Marquet's second book, which is Leadership as Language, which really drills into this whole idea about the way we speak to each other, the questions we ask, and so on. But this difference between blue thinking and red thinking is, I think, quite powerful. And if you think from an agile point of view, it's retrospective. It's pausing to do a retro and reflect on what we've learned and so on, rather than just delivering. Another issue around environment might be the way that teams are structured and how they're interacting with each other. So maybe some ideas from a book like Team Topologies about different structures and different types of interaction between teams. Maybe that's what a leader would do in trying to sort of address some of these environmental issues. And then of the sort of, if we've got a culture of that's on the waterfally side of the scale, about fixing things too early, or even the way that we allocate money to projects and calendars. So all of these are environmental issues, and as a leader, learning to see these, learning to try and figure and struggle with them and figure them out is one of the best ways that we could help our teams to thrive and to be more effective. And the final principle, and I realize I'm galloping through these a little bit, but hopefully I'm giving you a little bit of a flavor, is really that a lot of this is behavioral. It's about you as a leader. How do you show up? The little micro adjustments that you're making to the way that you interact with people and so on. And it's really this idea that we act our way into new thinking rather than thinking our way into new action. So there's a few ideas here about how do we develop new habits. A couple of quite sort of interesting books that you may have come across. And out of one of those books, I think it's the Atomic Habits book, is this idea about behavior. Changes of behavior requires three things: motivation to change, the ability to change, and just a quick prompt in order to change. Now, an example of a prompt might be, joining a Teams meeting, a Teams call. That's the prompt. And as I join, then it sort of reminds me that I'm maybe going to choose a mechanism or a technique from the list of IBL techniques that I might try in the next meeting. So there's about maybe over 20 different little techniques. So that's the ability to do it. And then your motivation is how do I get real sort of purpose and communicate the context to people so that they have that clarity around the sort of control, the part, the tuning control to competence and clarity. So I was going to break out into rooms again, but we're getting tight on time. So I'm just going to pop into the room and just sort of see of these principles. I'm going to stop sharing. Actually, no, I'm going to have to carry on sharing so that you can see them, but I still can't see you. So, so of these principles, which of them intrigues you a little bit? Either it's just sort of piqued your curiosity, or it's something that's puzzling you a bit and you just wanted to sort of explore a little bit. Which principle has got you thinking about how you might be able to bring it to life in your team?
So Bazil,
Yes.
so I'm thinking about the leaders fix the environment, not the people. Because I'm very interested in the relationship between leadership and cultural change.
Great.
And what I often struggle with is actually having leaders notice that that's what they do when their leadership is when they're setting the culture, they're setting the environment. They think they're managing people. They think they're deciding strategy and direction, and people just follow them. And it's my question is getting them to notice or pay attention to it's the environment that's actually in your remit.
Yeah, so I think to me it's another aspect of leadership is that real intense curiosity. So what is it about the environment that could be having an impact on people? It's in a VUCA world, right? So there won't be just one or two predictable variables that you can sort of go after. It'll be a whole mishmash of, work in progress, poor prioritization, poor technical practices, or not enough automation, or whatever it is. But I think it's partly to counter our bias about looking at people or at process. We could all, most meetups are probably around the theme of process. How do we do this a little bit better or that a little bit better? And I think this says, well, let's zoom out a little bit from process and actually look at the container, which is the environment around it all. And that in itself, it has its own dynamic to it. The environment isn't static; it'll keep changing. So how do we adapt to that? How about somebody else? Which of the 6 principles has got you slightly curious and wondering?
Feel free to pop in chat if you don't want to speak on camera. That's fine. Chat is good.
Thank you, Helen. You've done this before.
Hi, this is Jay. I really enjoy the leadership ladder and the intent, because sometimes as a leader, I talk about like who objects to this and no one says anything. So then we go do it instead of trying to get consensus. So it's kind of a similar pattern, and I actually super love it. And I'm gonna start using it today.
Wow. Okay. Thanks, Jay. Yeah, and actually,
thank you.
You illustrate another really lovely example from a different part of the process, which is around questions and our ability, the way we go for binary questions, because it's less of a sort of challenge to us to ask a binary yes/no question. Are you okay with this? There's only really one answer to that question, because it's quite difficult to say no. And so there's a technique which sort of echoes a little bit sort of planning poker, which is how comfortable are you with this decision? So, on a scale of 1 to 100 or something, how comfortable are you? So it's a probabilistic type question. So just switching a binary question into a probabilistic question is richer. You're gonna learn more, and you're gonna make people think a little bit more deeply about their response. So questioning, and we're back to language. If the how open is your language to people exploring their thoughts and sharing their thoughts?
Cool. Thanks for that. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jay.
Jana in the comments, I don't know what one of the words mean, but she said, I was wondering if all items apply to the Bani world as well. I don't know what Banny is. Is that something I'm missing out on?
I don't know either. Oh, Benny. Oh, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. Oh, okay. That's the first
That's a
time
new one.
I've come across that one. I don't know about all the items, but certainly to me, things around, so nonlinear to me is maybe around complexity and unpredictability. Anxious may play into safety, and being able to show up and to have your voice heard and that sort of thing. So making it safe, fixing the environment might also be something that can help there. Alex, you said leaders make it safe. Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting notice of yours, Alex. You've tried to make it safe in the past by providing answers. But yes, I think there's another thought that's going on here, which is one of anchoring. If you're a leader and you go in a bit early with your thoughts and your opinion, you can anchor the discussion for other people. It's difficult for them to move away from that anchoring. We will keep coming up with sexy acronym brandings. Okay. Well, thanks, Maru, and goodbye. Jan, I don't know if that came even close to answering your question. I mean, it's an interesting one. I'm going to go off and have a look at it myself. What's the brittle bit? That's got me curious. Where does brittle come from? Is that brittle in? Great, thanks, Don.
Maru, if Jana can't expand on the whole brittle thing, are you able to expand? You seem to be a man in the know.
I think I have a superhero that I call on called Google. That I'm gonna.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
Right now, I think brittle. No, I don't want to say anything stupid. So I'm gonna Google first.
You can channel the Google to us. Don, you unmuted.
So fragile. Jana said fragile, she thinks.
Oh, I see. Okay. Fragile, right.
We can speculate, yeah. Things change and break. When you try to break them, when you try to change them, they break again.
Right. Okay. Yeah, to me, that's probably that's a version of complex and unpredictable, I guess. You can't do one thing and expect a certain outcome. It's going to be somewhat unexpected. So a surprise, yeah. What about anyone else? We'll wind up in a couple of minutes. So, Matteo's at home now. Hi, Matteo.
Hi, Bazil. Hi, everybody.
Matteo and I worked closely together for the last few years on bringing IBL to life at Mimecast. So he knows quite a lot about this stuff. Anyone else got a favorite, or not a favorite, but one of those principles that resonates with you or intrigues you a bit? Yeah, I don't know whether to share it or not, whether you've Grant.
The one for me, and that I find myself saying quite a lot where I work, is the actual way to new thinking rather than thinking new action. And so that's something that really resonates with me.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's actually a key point, is how when we talk about leadership, it plays out in these micro interactions. How do you show up at your next meeting? How do you respond to bad news? How do you deepen someone's question, and so that they're exploring for them? These are all really very small micro interactions that you as a leader get to model and make space for and encourage and so on. And a lot of it is acting your way. And one of the things we developed and thought about with Matteo at Mimecast was we took teams of people and they did it all together, and then over the next couple of weeks they would be seeing each other in meetings and so on, and they would be able to sort of point out or notice if somebody was using a technique or something. It became quite a a safe place for people just to try things out, because some of this is counterintuitive. We've got so many biases and patterns to our thinking that we have to unlearn quite a bit in order to put in place this. So those small little habits are a way to do that. There was one guy who printed out the various techniques, and he had them behind his screen at home, so he could sort of was endlessly looking up and just reminding himself about this technique or that technique. Does anyone? Actually, I'm aware of time now, and I don't want to be eating into your evening. Shall we? If anyone got any last thoughts about anything at all they want to share, I will. I had
Maru,
a few.
Maru has his hands up.
Maru.
I have a question for you, Basil.
Yeah.
So the interaction model that one would follow, or models that one would follow in IBL, would be, because a lot of the stuff there resembles many things that I used in coaching, such as appreciative inquiry.
Exactly.
And various formats for engaging in dialogue to increase engagement, empowerment, stuff like that. But it's not as, this is very structured. So I was wondering, what's the dialogue model that is used, or the conversational model that is used to achieve or to work at each one of those 7 levels that you've shown?
Sure. So appreciative inquiry is definitely one of them. And, you know, how you ask questions and the powerful questions. There's, in terms of actual models, I'm not familiar enough with others to name them, but I did want to share one slide, which I think speaks to partly to your point, which is that I see the framework. I mean, there's a couple of books here that have been written by David, but then for me, just randomly, these are all books that I really like, and some of them have been referenced already, like 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. But humble leadership, to your point, is a lot about humble questioning, and that whole work from Edgar Schein around humble inquiry and that sort of thing, you know, fits in too. So I very much see IBL as a sort of a connector, if you like, of different things. And by all means, bring your coaching skills to bear in terms of making it safe or adding clarity. That might be another area where your coaching skills are very relevant. So, you know, you can bring different things in. It's by no means a sort of rigid model that you need to apply just these techniques. If I had a chance to take you through the other sort of 25 techniques or so, you would have recognized quite a lot of them. For example, there's one called 1, 2, 4 all, which is I'm sure quite a few of you have used from what's it called?
Liberating structures.
Liberating structures, exactly. Thank you, Claire. So, you know, ideas from wherever that help to create a safer holding space for people. By all means, you know, bring those along too.